In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about your act in the world.
Now, we use archetypal means of expression to represent how we act. And that's not the same thing as representing what the world is made out of. It's a very different thing. And so you could say, in some sense, we tell stories and understand stories so that we can figure out how people act and how they should act. And then we conduct science so that we can figure out what the world's like from a material objective perspective. And the two things coexist uneasily. I think the more primary form of knowledge is actually how to act, with the scientific model nested inside it, because the most important question that you have to solve as a living organism isn't what the world is made out of, it's how you should act in the world, say from a Darwinian perspective even, so that you can live long enough to reproduce. That's basically, from a strict biological perspective, in some sense, that's what you have to do in order to be successful. It's kind of obvious, first of all, because you're not very successful if you just go and die. And then, of course, death from a genetic perspective and failing to leave offspring are much the same thing. So, now, one of the questions might be, how is it that we conceive of the world as a place to act in? And that's partly, I'm going to outline a hypothesis for you and then explain the significance of that hypothesis. And the hypothesis involves the description of what you might consider constituent elements and also transformation processes. Okay, so as far as I can tell, the constituent elements of the stories that we tell about how people act and should act are characters. Now that makes sense, right? Because you really can't have a drama or a story without characters. Now the thing is, the characters have to be understandable. And so, for them to be understandable, they sort of have to be like you. Or they have to be like someone that you know. But they have to be human. But then again, it's not exactly that they're human. Because even when you're telling a story about what happened to you today, it's interesting to think about what you do. So someone might say, well, how was your day? And you say, fine. I mean, maybe that's the lowest level, lowest resolution, highest abstract story. My day was fine. It's a pretty boring story. It's better than terrible, I suppose, but it's not interesting and it's not detailed. But the person gets the notion that things went according to plan, or more specifically, that things unfolded the way you wanted them to, which is not exactly the same as according to plan. Because a plan is kind of a cold cognitive thing, you know, or expectation. The cognitive scientists sort of use how you wanted them to implies that you have desires and emotions and motivations, and that they inform the way that you're acting in the world. Because you don't just act in the world, you act in the world so that you try to turn it into something better than it is right now, assuming you have any sense. You know, because some people act on the world to make it worse than it is now, but we're going to forget about those people for now. So when you say fine to someone, you basically say, roughly speaking, I got what I wanted today without undue hassle. Okay. So that's a really condensed version of the events of the day, and it's not a very good story, although it might suffice for casual conversation. A person might say, no, what did you do today? And then maybe you'll say, oh, I woke up this morning and I went to university and, the subway took a lot longer than it usually does. And so, I used that time to do some studying, and then I got to school and I had a particularly dull lecture. But lunch was really good and I met some friends. And so that's kind of a story, right? And the person that you're talking to might listen to you. It's not a particularly compelling story, but it's probably better than fine. And you might say, well, why did you select those elements to talk about? You didn't talk about how many times you blinked your eyes the first minute that you woke up, and you didn't describe the motor movements that you used to put your left leg on the floor, and you didn't describe, what bowl you used for breakfast. And the reason you didn't do that is because A, you don't remember for whatever reason, and B, you don't care, and neither does your listener. But that's the peculiar thing, is that your listener is going to care about some things and not care about other things. And if you're a good storyteller, you kind of automatically know which of those things that you should talk about so that you're interesting, and which of the things you should ignore so that you're not boring your listener to death. And you also understand that they will also understand that. But you don't know how you do that. All you know is that you're trying to tell an interesting story. And in some sense, what you're doing is you're trying to reduce a sequence of actions and conceptions of exceptional complexity to the gist, right, which is like the essential or the moral in some sense, and you're trying to convey that, and the other person is listening, partly because they want to indicate that they care for you and would like to know, they want to stay caught up with your ongoing narrative so that they understand you, and maybe also because they might think that they'll garner some, bit of information, factual or behavioral, that might aid them in some way. And we're doing that to each other all the time, and we automatically do this. We automatically know how to tell stories. And so what I'm saying is that even the person that you describe when you describe yourself to someone else isn't exactly you. It's some representation of you as a sort of generic human being that's going about doing certain kinds of interesting things in the world. Or here's a way of thinking about it roughly, is that you make yourself the hero of your own story. And so you kind of know that because when you go to a movie, and movies are usually romances, say, or hero stories, romances or adventures or both, roughly speaking, and sometimes they turn out well and that's a comedy, and sometimes they don't turn out so well and that's a tragedy. But when you go there, what you basically see is a story about another person who's sort of like you, who's the hero, and what you do is you track them through a sequence of adventures. And usually what you track them through isn't things were good and then they stayed good and then at the end they were still the same as they were at the beginning and good. Because why do you want to watch that? And you might say, well, you should, because isn't that pleasant? The person's happy and then they stay happy and then they end happy and everyone's happy. Why isn't that interesting? But it isn't. And really what you want to see is, you want to see someone get into trouble and fail in a spectacularly interesting way, or you want to see someone get into trouble and then overcome it in a spectacularly interesting way. And so there's this idea in the story that the person has to undergo some kind of transformation in the midst of their travails and efforts in order for it to be interesting. So they have to start in one place, they have to end up somewhere that's not so good in a very, very complicated way, and then maybe by transforming their character, or by transforming the surroundings, or by coming to some sort of realization, or maybe just by dim-witted luck, they manage to solve the set of problems and emerge triumphant at the other end. Alright, so that's the meaning of Jonah and the whale. Now remember what happens to Jonah is that he's got this destiny he's supposed to be pursuing, and he decides that it's too much trouble. Well, not unsurprisingly, because if you remember what he was told to do was go to tell a whole city that they were misbehaving, assuming rightly as he did that would not make him particularly popular, and maybe he'd get killed, and even if he didn't, it would be extraordinarily difficult. He thought, there's no damn way I'm doing that. So he denied his destiny, and as a consequence, he fell into the abyss and was swallowed up. And then because he repented and decided to carry on with his responsibilities, the creature of the abyss spit him back up and he got to go along his merry way. Now you might say, well, nothing like that has ever happened to you, but that's wrong. Things like that happen to you all the time, and you know it.